And I'm going to turn it over to Danielle and Amy. And I think that at some point we might want to pin the panel. And I think as co-host you can do that, but if not, let me know.
Okay, so let's get started. So my name is Danielle Murphy. I'm a third year learning sciences student, and we have on chat Amy Adair. She's also a third year learning sciences student. So if you have any questions throughout the event for anything, please throw them in the chat. And if you have questions that you would like to share in the Q&A at the end, please just throw them in the chat. Don't save them. Amy's going to be taking care of you there. So welcome to today's session. Today we have a panel discussion with editors from educational research journals. And the aim of today is for our students to learn about the publication process. So the format for the session will be as follows. I will introduce the panelists to you, the audience, and then the panelists will briefly share a piece of advice, something that they think would be really useful for students to know. Then we have a planned panel discussion with some predetermined questions, and then we will open up the session to questions from the audience. So let's begin by introducing the panelists to you. So today we have Dr. Angela Odonnell, who is a current and past member of editorial boards for several journals, including Contemporary Educational Psychologist and Educational Psychologist. We have Dr. Ravit Duncan, who is a current associate editor for the Journal of the Learning Sciences, current learning section co-editor for science education, and past associate editor for the Journal of Research and Science Teaching. We also have Dr. Beth Rubin, who is a past associate editor for Anthropology and Education Quarterly. We have Dr. Chiu, who is a current associate editor of Psychometrica and Journal of Classification. And we have Dr. Mary Beth Gasman, who is a current editor of Pathways, a journal of humanistic and social inquiry. So now that we've met the panelists, we are going to open just by asking kind of a general question. So what is a piece of advice that you think would be useful for us graduate students to know? This can be something from your own experience writing or also, but primarily editing. So what's a piece of advice you can share with the audience today about the publication process? And I'm just going to ask the person who's next on my screen. So Ravit, please, can you share with us?
Hi. Yes. So the piece of advice that I'm going to share is that editors and associate editors are humans, they're people, and that you should not be shy about reaching out to them via email or calling if you have any questions about reviews, the journals, the reviews you received, the decision. Reach out and talk to them.
Thank you. Dr. Rubin?
I have a lot of advice, but one piece that I'll share now is that when you are drafting an article for a publication, make sure that you put a lot of time into your findings. One of the things I found most often as an associate editor was that their authors would create really beautiful lit reviews and rationales for their project, but then when you got to the data analysis and findings, things kind of fell off. So pay attention to your findings.
Thank you. Dr. Chiu?
All right, so the idea I would like to share today is no writing, no publications. So you might expect to hear me saying that you should have solid technical and statistical training so that you can write professional manuscripts. No one will deny that these are very important in my field, but everybody knows it. What people may not know or refuse to know is that writing is equally important. Many authors in my field have the idea that these journals publish technical and theoretical papers, so the technicality of the proposed methods is far more important than writing. But let's face it, without good writing, your nice methods will never be published. So that's the advice that I would like to give students.
Thank you. Dr. Gasman?
Thank you. So I think I'll go to the area of reviewer comments. And I think some of the best advice I ever got when I was younger is that when you get the reviewer comments back, rather than internalize them, because sometimes people write things that are not kind, and you need to remember that that's about them and it's not about you. Okay, it doesn't define you. It says absolutely nothing about who you are. It says absolutely everything about who they are if they write really unkind things. And so, sometimes you'll get a really helpful review, but other times you'll get something that's sort of stinging and mean. And so what I was told when I was much younger is rewrite the reviewer comments in your own words and just take them. I usually put them in an Excel spreadsheet so I can look over them. Put them in your own words so that you don't have to look at that mean review. And that has, and I, every once in a while I get one of these, and I still do it to this day, because there's no reason why we need to let someone's issues kind of influence us or define us. And so that's some of the very best advice I ever got.
Thank you. And Dr. O'Donnell?
Mary Beth stole my advice, but
Sorry.
One piece of advice that I got as a graduate student was to write as though your audience can't make any inferences. And I think when you write with that frame of mind, you tend to make your thinking explicit, and particularly around what Beth had suggested about the findings, rather than assume that people know what you meant. Be very careful to make it clear what you're actually communicating.
Thank you so much to all of you. This advice has been so helpful. And something I just want to highlight for our audience is that the editors we have today range across quantitative and qualitative journals. And I think that that advice is coming through in what you're sharing with us today. So thank you. So now we're going to move into the panel discussion, and we've selected 5 questions to ask the panelists. Each question will be directed to a point person. Then after that person shares, we can open up the discussion for other panelists to respond also. Just keeping time in mind, we've allocated about 30 minutes for this section, which boils down to 6 minutes per question. So we ask the first panelist who responds to please keep your response to under 3 minutes so that other panelists can join in too if they would like. So the first question is for Dr. Gasman, and here we would like to know, for new students who are kind of entering this whole publication process, and for all of us, what are the common reasons that papers get rejected?
All right, this is a great question. I want to say one thing at the outset and then kind of go a little bit more deeply. The first thing is, I think the number one reason why papers are rejected is because people haven't done their homework. They haven't worked on their writing. They haven't read widely. They kind of get an idea about something and then forget that there are lots and lots of people who've gone before them. And so that's really important to read as widely as you can. And I also think that people they don't take a look at the journal. They don't read articles in the journal and see what the journal expectations are. So for me, when I'm reading a paper and I review for all different kinds of journals, I would say these are the things that are hangups for me when I'm reading. The writing. If the writing is really poor, that's going to be problematic, because as Angela just said, you cannot get your ideas across if it's not well written. I think that there are a lot higher expectations for methods, especially for qualitative work, than there used to be. And you need to be aware of what those expectations are for the journal where you're applying. Some journals are okay with a small method section. Others, it's pages upon pages. And the way that I work with that is I look at articles that are the lead article in journals, and I keep a little file of great method sections, and I use them as examples. The other thing I would say, for me, the number one thing that I see people not do is they have a great theory section and they have a great literature review, but they don't use either one of those to analyze their findings. And that's the same thing when you're writing a dissertation. This is like the number one thing that people do. They just string the findings together and there's no analysis. So you definitely, that's a big hang up. And then the last thing I would say is, there are no recommendations, no recommendations for policy or practice or future research. And so, one of your goals as an author is you got to tell people what to do with this work. You got to lead people. And I also think you should have a meaty conclusion. And I think people tend to be a little skimpy sometimes about these kinds of things. And, if it's a little longer, that's okay. Put your all into it and let people cut later on. But for me, the best thing you can do is to look at what has already been published in those journals and see the caliber of work, and then use that as a model. And that really, really helps.
Thank you. That was so valuable. Would anybody else like to chip in with this question? What are the common reasons that papers get rejected?
I can jump in real quick. I think largely it's because of a lack of fit between what you're doing and the journal. So look at the board, the editorial board. So look at what is being published in there and who's publishing in there. Look at the editorial board. It's likely that one of them will be reviewing your paper. So are there people there who you think are bringing expertise to the table that is relevant to what you're writing? That's adding on to what was said.
Thank you. So we have time for one more response. Would anybody else like to weigh in for this question? What are the common reasons that papers get rejected?
Just to emphasize, I think Mary Beth did a great overview, and really emphasize that fact of, or that idea of looking at the journal that you're aiming towards and looking at a whole bunch of work from there and seeing what kinds of things get published, how they're structured, where the emphasis is, those kinds of things.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we will now move on to the next question, and this is primarily going to Dr. Duncan. So we would like to understand kind of the nuts and bolts of the publication process. So my question for you is, how does the publication process work from submission to decision?
So I want to qualify this by saying that different journals have somewhat different procedures. So, peer review for peer-reviewed journals is universal, but exactly how it happens and the differences between the roles of editors-in-chief, associate editors, so on, might vary a bit. So I'm going to share some from my experience and what I know, but I think this will be exactly the place for other panelists to jump in with their own experiences, because in different fields, where I'm going to be talking predominantly science and learning science. So the first thing is you submit, assuming that what you submitted meets the minimum requirements, and then you get into the system. Sometimes they will send it back if you didn't blind it or something like that. So make sure you read the instructions to the authors. Pretty much all journals have that, so read them carefully before submitting. Then usually it's the editors-in-chief that decide whether or not this is going to move on to an associate editor and then for review. Some journals, not all journals, some journals have what's called a desk reject. Usually these, and the percent of desk rejects vary dramatically and are largely, I think, a relationship between whether people understand what this journal is about and how many submissions they get. So desk rejects happen usually because of lack of fit. Someone is just submitted an article that does not fit the scope of the journal, or is just too pilotish and not substantive enough. So it maybe it fits, but it's just flimsy. However, editors-in-chiefs are very careful around this. So it is not the case that desk rejects go out like hot cross buns. They're very, very careful. And most articles that are submitted will go on to an associate editor. So some journals don't have an associate editor team, and the editor-in-chief does everything. Many other journals do have some sort of second tier of whatever they're called, associate editors, section editors. And they will get the article and then they need to select reviewers. Sometimes there's someone on the editorial team who might suggest some reviewers. So you might get a list of 3 reviewers and you can decide as the associate editor, do I think these reviewers are a good fit for the article or not? But oftentimes you're selecting them from scratch. The system does pull recommendations based on keywords, which is why as reviewers, you should put the right keywords in, and whatever keywords you're putting in the paper make a difference, because the matching, now the editor, associate editor doesn't have to go with the list that the publication system, the submission system provides, but those I do find are quite helpful. And if you have a well curated system and managed system, the names that come up as possible reviewers do actually make a lot of sense. And I do often use names from that list. If I have someone else in mind, I can either add them as a reviewer to the system, and then they get an email asking them if they're willing to first get into the system and review the paper. Or I can select my own reviewers that I know have reviewed in the past, but are not showing up in the recommended list. Once we select, most journals go with 3 reviewers. Again, this can vary a little bit, but most journals go with 3 reviewers. The way I do it is I will select about 4 or 5 reviewers, and I will send it out to them, and sometimes they don't respond at all, which is very poor form. So make sure you respond when you get a request to review, even if it's no, just freaking respond, because otherwise the editor has no idea where you stand. So sometimes people don't respond. Most often people do respond. Either they decline, which is fair, you're allowed to do that, or they accept. So I will check it and keep adding reviewers until I get to 3. What happens sometimes is if I send it out to 5 and 4 accept, then your paper has 4 reviewers. Doesn't happen often, but it can. So that's why you might sometimes get somewhat different number of reviewers. Goes out to reviews. It hangs out there usually for a month. If your reviewer is on top of it, they will send it back when they're supposed to send it back. Delays happen, and they happen often. For a week, 2 weeks, sometimes longer. And then the editor has to make a decision. Do I ask a whole new reviewer because someone's been super tardy? Or do I just keep begging the person who's tardy to do the review? And you sometimes have to make a decision. If that person all of a sudden, after it being in review for 60 days goes, I'm sorry, I just can't handle it, then you do need to send it out. So the reason sometimes these things take so long is that process of finding reviewers, which can sometimes take a long time, especially in the summer, having people review it in time, get it back to you. As an associate editor, I try very, very hard not to be late with my decision letters. And usually I think it's not the associate editors that are holding up the line, but then you write, as an associate editor, I will obviously read the article. I tend to like reading the article before I look at the reviews so that I'm not biased. I'll read the article, see what I think, then I'll read the reviews, and then I have to make a decision. If all the reviews are concordant with each other, that decision is usually pretty easy. If the reviews are all over the place, that decision becomes a little harder. Then the reviewer's expertise and the substance of what they've said comes into play. So if I have a new reviewer that I don't know very well, that's saying things that I think are a little bit off to left field, and the other 2 reviewers are saying something else, I will tend to go with the other reviewers. We do have, as associate editors, the option of asking for yet another review. Obviously, that delays the whole process, but you can do that if you're really torn and having a hard time making a decision. Let's assume I have a sense of what the decision is going to be. It can either be reject, complete reject, meaning we don't want to see this paper again. It could be reject but encourage resubmission, which means you can resubmit again, revise and resubmit, accept with major, accept with minor. Again, different journals have slightly different categories, but that's about it. Danielle, tell me how long I've got, because I feel like I've been talking forever. Okay, so basically, associate editor writes a decision letter, editor-in-chief approves, and it goes out to you, and then you get into the revision and whatnot process.
Thank you. That was really helpful. So I'm going to dive into the next question because it's actually connected. So this question is for Dr. Rubin, and Dr. Duncan, you spoke about this a little bit, but the question for Dr. Rubin is, who chooses the reviewers for an article and how are reviewers selected?
I mean, I think Ravi covered that pretty well in hers, in you know, the overview she gave. It varies from journal to journal, but often an associate editor. The online system that journals use will cough up lists of people who check the same keywords as the article, but you also can go from your own knowledge of people in the field. I definitely have resorted to, you know, searching the internet for academics in similar fields when I come up dry for a particular piece. I mean, the only thing I'll add is, you know, if your work is interdisciplinary, well, if as an associate editor, I'm looking at interdisciplinary work, I try to get reviewers from different, from the appropriate disciplines to look at it, or if somebody, if a piece is from a different, it involves work done in a different country, try to find somebody with expertise in that. So, you know, trying to find people who are familiar with at least part of, if not all of, what the submitter is trying to accomplish in their piece.
Thank you. So I guess we're kind of covering the same kind of landscape here. So we're looking at how the publication process works and also reviewers and their place in the whole process. So I'm just going to open this up to the panel. Would anybody else like to chip in? Oh, yeah, go on.
I do have one thing just to add to Ravit's overview of the process. The journal that I was associate editor on, Anthropology and Education Quarterly, had a process that I don't know of any other journals that have this process, but it was a two-step review process where the associate editors working as a team convened a small review committee to look at a piece, then give feedback to the author, and the author had an opportunity often to revise before it got sent out for peer review. So it was theoretically a very helpful process in that it was meant to kind of cultivate new researchers and really, you know, help people get their pieces into good shape before they went out for peer review. And it did sometimes work that way. Sometimes it also really slowed things down. So it was kind of a, you know, there were pros and cons to that way of going about the review process. And I don't know if there are other journals who do that really.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to add in? Okay, so we can move ahead. So again, I think this question is connected, but maybe asking it a slightly different way will bring up some more information. So this question is primarily for you, Dr. Odonnell, and Dr. Duncan already touched on this, but what exactly are the roles of the different types of editors and reviewers, and kind of how do they work together in this process? Just anything else that you'd like to share would be helpful.
Well, I think Ravi described the process pretty well. There are journals that don't have associate editors. So, for example, the Journal of Experimental Education had a managing editor and an editorial board, and then a suite of ad hoc reviewers. And the editor would pick people from the editorial board as the initial reviewers and occasionally send it out for ad hoc review. And that's, you know, just peculiar to that particular journal. It can be difficult in some areas to get people with sufficient expertise. For example, I think Chiu would probably speak to this in terms of psychometrica. The kind of articles submitted there are highly technical and may not be within, you know, there may be a very narrow group of reviewers who are eligible to actually provide a coherent review. So another aspect of knowing your journal is knowing what range of individuals actually subscribe to that journal. I think it's possible, for instance, for somebody submitting an article to suggest that there are asked that an article not be sent to a particular reviewer, perhaps because of a conflict in ideology or orientation. So I think that's also important to keep in mind.
Thank you. That was very helpful. And I think we have Dr. Jacoma in the audience. Would you like to chime in?
Hey, everybody. Sure. So I was an editor of EPA, Educational Evaluation Policy Analysis, for a number of years. And of course, gone through the review process, and I've been a reviewer, I've been reviewed. So the way I think about this, and I think the folks that have talked, I mean, I agree with everything they've said, they've been great. But the model that I use is that this is a conversation between three parties, essentially, the authors, the reviewers, and the editors. And you have to be mindful of that all through the process. So in terms of the relationship, it was asked about the reviewer and the editors, that can vary quite a bit. It can vary in the selection process. The reviewers could be selected from a list, or when I did it, we spent a lot of time picking reviewers because I felt it made the editor job a lot better when I made sure I was getting really expert reviews in a particular area. But once those reviews come in, the editor, some editors just sort of forward the reviews without really doing much. And that's tough as an author, I think, because you don't know how to make sense of it. I think a good editor will tell will signal to the authors, really pay attention to this, and that, and without dismissing reviewers, not. But the conversation is really, you get these reviews, and I think Mary Beth said, the first reaction is, well, they're all idiots, they don't get it. But then, of course, you say, well, actually, I need to pay attention to it, and you need to respond to each one as an individual. You're responding to individual reviewers who've put in a lot of time in doing these reviews, and you need to be respectful of that. You need to pay attention. You don't always have to agree with them. You can contest their claims, but you have to contest them in a reasonable way. You can't just dismiss them, right? You have to, and you can't dismiss everybody's claims, because then you're just going to have a rejection. But if there are certain things you say, here's why we didn't do this or that, then that's okay if it seems that you're really being responsive. So you go through that review item by item on everything that they said, and you say, here's how we responded to your thing. Sometimes reviewers will tell you, I'll highlight a problem, but they'll give you solutions. I don't think you're obligated to take their solutions, but you are obligated to take their concerns. And if three people are concerned, then there's probably something that's an issue, because these are supposed to be people who are expert and they're not getting what you're trying to say. So anyway, I think if you think about human beings on the other side of that, who have human reactions, that will help as well. And that even goes to the initial the initial submission. If you have sloppy typos and things like that, and reviewers volunteering their time, I'm telling you, I just sort of have this attitude, like, serious, immediately you create a kind of reaction that's unnecessary. If your tables aren't formatted decently, like if you haven't had the care to prepare the document the way, you should, and then I have to review this, even if I just know that I have just an attitude that's not great, and I'm sure other reviewers do too. So you don't want to tick them off for silly reasons, tick them off for substantive kinds of reasons, and then they can deal with it, right? So anyway, so I just think about it always as there are human beings on all sides of this who are negotiating this thing, and you're just a player in that.
Thank you. That was really helpful. And I want to pick up on one of the points you said about contesting reviews. So I have a question connected to that for Dr. Chiu. So what happens if you can't address a reviewer's comment entirely? And what happens if you disagree? How do you deal with that? And how much leeway do you have as a writer?
Sure. For the first question, here is my suggestion. You should really try harder again, because not being able to address a reviewer's comment entirely may lead to another round of review or a rejection. But and it's always helpful to look at the problem from different angles or perspectives. So for example, I do cognitive diagnosis. You don't have to know what it is. But when you get a question or comment that you don't know what to do, that you may want to look at the problem from, say, IRT's perspective or classical test theory perspective, that usually is very helpful. And keep in mind that it is not acceptable if it can be addressed, but you did not try hard enough. But still, but what if you still cannot answer the question after you try hard? First, if you cannot address a reviewer's comment entirely because it is the limitation of your method, then you need to honestly say it in your paper. Don't try to hide it, because sooner or later people will find out. But even if it is a limitation, you still need to provide some possible, say, future research directions or suggestions on how to fix the limitation. And second, if the reviewer points out some error or weakness of your method, and you cannot address it because the reviewer is right, then there are a couple of options. So if it can be fixed, then you definitely need to fix it. But if it's beyond repair, then you can perform something called, in our field, called robustness study, to assess how robust your method is to the error or violation. So this is something worth doing, because it may save your paper from being rejected if it turns out that your method is sufficiently robust. So that is a good way to do. But in the past years, I can only think of several scenarios that I, as an author, did not address reviewers' comment entirely. The first scenario is that the comment leads to another big topic that is a paper of its own right. Then it's definitely fine to point it out. And second, the comment is beyond the scope of the manuscript. So for these two instances, you can point it out, but you need to give a thorough justification to support your claims. And the third one is that the reviewer is, could be wrong, or the comment or the request is inappropriate. So reviewers make mistakes too. So if you are 100% sure that that's a mistake from the reviewer's side, then it's definitely fine to point it out. But again, you want to really think it through, because it happens quite frequently that you think that's the reviewer is wrong, but it turns out that it's the authors who are wrong. And you don't want that to happen. And so the next question is, what happens if you disagree with the reviewer's or editor's decision? So this question leads to two sub-questions: what you can do and what you are willing to do. What you can do is to appeal. If you like, you can write to the editor expressing your concerns with very strong justifications. And editors rely heavily on the comments from the associate editors and reviewers to make their final decisions. And the comments from the reviewers could be convergent or divergent, but either way, if you don't agree with them and you want to appeal, that you need to have very strong evidence showing that they are wrong. Otherwise, don't do it. However, you need to evaluate beforehand how likely your appeal will be accepted and handled, because you don't want to waste your time on that. And this leads to the second sub-question. What are you willing to do? So the whole appealing process could be very long. And well, I mean, I have never encountered such cases as an associate editor, knock on wood, but had a terrible experience as an author. So our manuscript was rejected. Some of the reviewers liked it, but the other did not like it. So the argument is that our method had a technical weakness. However, although our method had this theoretical shortcoming, but it is practically very useful. And we clearly addressed the little flaw in our manuscript. However, these reviewers just didn't buy it. So we chose to appeal. But in the end, it took us 6 years to get it published. And believe me, this is a kind of experience you don't want to have, especially if you are under pressure of going out for tenure. So, so therefore, it might have been wiser if we had chosen to submit it to somewhere else. But these are just my answers. I hope they are helpful, but other panelists may have different ideas.
Yeah, just to chime in on this one, and also Brittany raised the question of, you know, what if it feels like the reviewer just has a different opinion or agenda than what's in your paper? I do think that, like Ravit said, it's helpful to try to, if a reviewer seems really off, to take a look at your paper and try to see how you could be clearer about what it is that you're trying to do. So, I mean, I know, you know, your kind of blood pressure will go up and steam starts coming out of your ears. It's like that, you know, that's not what this is about at all. They don't understand, you know, and that's, you know, I totally get that. And I've been there myself many a time, but it also is a little clue to you that you weren't 100% clear in what your goals were with the paper or your method or some aspect. Something wasn't made crystal clear. So that's kind of a hint to you that you need to go back and make it really clear what it is that you're trying, what you are and you are not trying to accomplish. Especially in qualitative work, it's really important to be clear about what it is that you're claiming. You are almost never claiming that something is generalizable, right? So you have to explain why your analysis provides insight that is meaningful and useful while not applying to every single case everywhere of that same thing. So you know, if you can take those areas of confusion and look at where you can strengthen the clarity around what you're doing. You know, I would say, like, you can do or say almost anything as long as you justify it. You have to make the case. And also, if a reviewer's really off, I mean, associate editors and editors read the letters too, and they can see that for themselves. And sometimes you will get feedback from an editor-in-chief or an associate editor that makes it clear that they also think the reviewers were off base. So they may either imply or directly say that you should pay more attention to feedback from reviewer 1 versus reviewer 2. And so that should be taken seriously as an indication that the editor is weighing certain reviewers' feedback more heavily. And also, you know, you can address, you know, you don't have to address every concern in that you don't have to make a change based on everything raised by the reviewers, but it's really good if you can speak to all the concerns raised by reviewers, even if it's to say, I've looked at this concern raised by reviewer 2, and here's why I've decided to not make any changes, because I think that this is really misinterpretation or something like that.
Thank you. That was so helpful. So I'm just addressing questions that are appearing in the chat. So Nama, you asked a question. Do you want to ask, or do you want me to read it for you?
Sure. I moved rooms, so now I can ask questions. Yeah, so later on in the process, when we get to the point of being reviewers, is it ever appropriate to reject a request to review, not because you don't have time or whatever, but because you don't think that you have the appropriate expertise?
I do that like 6 times a week. So yeah.
I guess following up just very briefly, if so, is there something else that you should do? Like, should you also follow up with the editor or something to say that that's why you rejected, or just reject outright?
Most of the systems give you an option for saying why you are not going to do it. So, and they also sometimes will give you an option to recommend somebody to do it. So, like I'm like Drew, I'm asked, I don't know, sometimes it's like 8 to 10 a week or something that I'm asked to review. And so I usually will say yes if it's within my area, like almost always, but I get asked to review things that I have absolutely no expertise on. And so what I do typically is I know people who might have some expertise, and I will reject it, and it sends a message to the editor. And then I write in some people who might be able to do it. But there are times where I'm asked to recommend things, to review things, and I have no idea what the paper is even remotely about. Like, I don't even understand a word in the title. And so in that case, I just reject it and say, I'm sorry, I'm just not the appropriate person to do this. But normally you don't really have to follow up in any way. There, on occasion, I've been in a situation where I know the editor, so I've just written to them and say, hey, I'd love to do this, but I just don't feel like I have I don't have the knowledge to do this. And that's if I know them, but you don't really need to. The system helps you.
Okay, thank you. Oh,
I want
sorry.
to say something in response to that, but also make another point as well. Sometimes editors will ask you to review a piece because they think you can be a general reader. Because a lot of journals, they don't intend to only appeal to the most expert audience. They want to appeal. But the downside for reviewers is that you get tired of doing that. In fact, I think there's an editorial board that I'm on that I want to step down from because they've decided I'm really useful as a general reader. So I get all of these requests to review things that are really not of much interest to me because apparently they've decided I'm useful in this way. But it's not at all useful for me to constantly be evaluating papers outside my area. The other thing, I don't think anybody's really talked about the letter that you submit along with your revision. So with the revision, it's customary to submit a letter that just responds in detail to every single editorial and reviewer point. I would say, one of the, reviewers read those letters too. And you create a very strong, if you show in that letter that you have addressed in some way virtually every criticism, and maybe there's not, even where you disagree, a lot of times the way you address it is to say, that's not really what we meant. So on page 15, we added 2 paragraphs to explain this, to explain that that wasn't the idea we meant. So by, you create a strong argument for your revision when you show in your letter that you have addressed in detail, and you don't just say, we addressed this by expanding our literature review. That's not persuasive at all. That gives me license as a reviewer and editor to say they didn't take this process seriously, and I don't really want to bother with this manuscript anymore. But if they say in detail, here's what we changed, you can find it on page 15, the middle paragraph. you know, they've made a really strong case. You've made a really strong case that you have addressed all of these concerns, and in general, and that's also a place for the smaller number of issues that you really disagree with. You don't have to put your entire disagreement in the manuscript. You can put much of your argument for why you don't want to make this change or why it wouldn't be appropriate in the letter. Not all of that has to go in the manuscript.
Okay, thank you. So we have a couple of hands raised. So I'm just going to go down in the order that they appeared. So Dr. Gasman, did you want to share?
I did. I wanted to pass on another kind of piece of advice that I got when I was a brand new faculty member from someone named Wayne Urban, who's a historian. And I went into his office when I was like a brand new professor, and he just seemed real happy every day, and I wanted to know like why he seemed so satisfied with his career, and because I tend to be a really positive person, so I wanted to know like what it was, because some faculty weren't so happy, you know, and so he invited me to sit down and like have a little conversation with them, and he started to give me advice, and some of the advice was so good, and it's things I've held on to, and this one in particular. He told me, he's like, you know, one of the issues with younger scholars is that they tend to be perfectionists. And that is, you know, there's that whole saying, perfect is the enemy of the good, right? And he said that is just their downfall. So he said, what happens is you have all these young scholars who give these great papers at conferences. They never turn them into articles, number one. And number two, even if they do turn them into articles, they're so obsessed with them being perfect that they don't send them in. And he said, you know, editors and reviewers are wonderful friends that you don't even realize you're getting them for free. You know, they're free. It's like free feedback. And so I've always really kept that in mind. And yes, occasionally a reviewer will say something that just like, oh, you know, but by and large, I would agree with what Drew was saying, is that by and large, I think that all of the reviewers that I have had have helped to make my work stronger. I want to say two things connected to that. One, I have revised and resubmitted every single paper where I got to revise and resubmit. Okay. And so, you know, I can't even remember how many articles I have, peer-reviewed articles I've published at this point, but here's what I will say. Only one of them was accepted as is. Okay. And I've published over 100. Okay. So one of them was published as is. So that's really important for everybody to understand. Every other one was a revise and resubmit. And some of them, especially the ones that might have been in like the American Education Research Journal, were 5 to 6 revise and resubmits, okay? And I worked on them and worked on them and worked on them, and they got better and better and better. And many of them ended up being the lead article, right? Which is a kind of important, seems silly, but can be an important thing, or at least it was, you know, for a long time where I was. So that's one thing. And then another thing is, that I think that one thing I want to say is that, and this covers not just journal articles, but also books. It doesn't matter kind of how long you've been at this, you're still going to be asked to do revisions. You're still going to be challenged on your ideas. And you, like a few years ago, I submitted an entire book manuscript to my editor. This is a book that came out with Harvard University Press. And she said, you know, I love this book. And then she sent me the book. I tell people this all the time, the book Stylish Academic Writing by Helen Sword, which is one of my absolute favorite books. And she said, read this book from cover to cover. And then I want you just to rewrite your whole manuscript. Okay. I cried inside, okay, because I had worked for 2 years to write that manuscript and 3 years of research. But I will tell you something. Oh my God, I'm so grateful to her. She changed my whole way of writing. She changed my whole approach. She helped me to speak to larger audiences, and she was tough, but she was gracious about it. And so I would just tell you to don't get so, you know, sometimes people get really hung up on not taking that advice and getting stubborn about it, right? And I think that in the end, it can really help you. It can transform you as a writer and a researcher. Not the meanness, let that go, but the stuff that's constructive, it can just change your life completely. And every day that I can get an editor and a reviewer to read my work, oh, I'm so happy, because I mean, it's free. You know, people pay for that, so it's free. So I think I just wanted to say that. I think that's really important to keep in mind.
Thank you so much. This advice is also helpful. So we just have 4 minutes till the end of the session, and I see Dr. Chiu, you have your hand raised, and also Dr. Jacoma. So yes, please share.
Yes, I just want to point out that even if your paper is rejected, it would be helpful if you still take the comments into account. You know, as Angela said, that our field is very narrow. So I once was a reviewer of a paper and it was rejected. And 2 weeks later, you know, I wrote a lot of comments. But then 2 weeks later, I got the same paper to review, and from a different journal. But the authors did not change anything. So I was like, should I write a different set of reviews, or what should I do now? Because I already did a lot for the other journal, but then now I got the same thing again. So you know that in the end, that this kind of paper will be rejected again. So be prepared that you may see the same reviewers again and again, even if you switch from one journal to the other. So it will be still very helpful if you take these comments into account, even if your paper is rejected.
Okay, I'm going to make 2 comments that have that aren't exactly about the review process, but I think they're really important. One is, I would encourage you to talk to your advisors, people doing work in your field, and see if you can actually participate in the review process itself. I've done that with some students. I think it's really helpful to see what reviews look like, to actually give feedback. Journals are usually willing. If I have a student that I think would be helpful in reviewing this, I will contact the editor when they ask me, and I'll say, is it okay if I have a student do that as well? And invariably they say yes, so do that. The other thing is, I think it's a habit of mine of being able to take constructive criticism and do well with it. And a lot of times in our field, and this is students, but it's also people with PhDs. People ask you to read a paper, and people won't really take the advice and address it in a meaningful kind of way. So I would encourage you is to find people, certainly your faculty advisors and people like that, but others who are going to be really critical in the way Mary Beth described. People that will, rip your stuff. And the people I co-write with, authors and stuff, we rip each other like harshly, and that's really helpful. If I give papers to people and they come back and say, this is really good, great job, I don't give it to them again because it's not helpful to me. So, seek criticism, even if it's not that pleasant, because that process of getting it, receiving it, learning how to work it is really, really important, and will hold you in good stead, because it's a lot better to get beaten up by your friends than beaten up, whether it's a submission, a grant submission, or something like that. You don't want to be doing that. You want to get beat up by locals.
Thank you so much. I think I speak for all of us here when I say all of the advice today has been absolutely amazing. So thank you so much to all the panelists and professors who have chipped in. This has really been amazing. Thank you.
And don't forget, next week we have Jasmine Ma and Molly Keldon and Mary Beth Gasman is hosting funders workshop, like writing grants workshop.
Grant writing, yeah, grant writing. So yes, absolutely. Thanks, everybody. This was fun.
See you next week. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.